Why would one man decide to annihilate an entire people? What kind of hatred could justify gas chambers, death trains, and millions of lives extinguished? This is not an easy story, but it is one that must be told. Today we are going inside one of the darkest chapters in human history, Adolf Hitler's obsession with destroying the Jewish people. Where did that hatred originate? How did it spread so rapidly across an entire continent? And why did so many ordinary people follow him? How far can the hatred of a single man reach? Can a twisted ideology transform itself into state policy and drag an entire civilization into the abyss? This is not simply the story of a dictator. It is the story of how contempt, ignorance, and indifference can become instruments of destruction more lethal than any army. During the Second World War, the world witnessed absolute horror. Millions of people were persecuted, imprisoned, tortured, and murdered solely for being who they were. Jews, Roma, communists, people with disabilities, homosexuals, all were marked. All were converted into targets of a machine engineered to destroy them without mercy or pause. But among all those atrocities, one question continues to haunt humanity. Why did Hitler hate the Jews? That question has no simple answer. It was not a personal whim or an isolated obsession. The anti-Semitism that defined the Nazi regime had roots far deeper than any single man. To understand the genocide, we must first understand the man behind the plan and the world that shaped him. Adolf Hitler was not born hating. His childhood, though difficult, carried no particular hostility toward Jewish people. He was just another child with dreams, frustrations, and family conflicts. But something shifted. Something dark began to take root inside him when the world repeatedly slammed its doors in his face. Not once, not twice, again and again. Every rejection, every failure, every humiliation piled up like embers beneath his skin. When Hitler finally discovered an ideology that gave meaning to his rage, it was already too late. It had become his compass. What began as explosive speeches in crowded beer halls would eventually lead to the construction of gas chambers at Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, places where humanity descended to its lowest point. But to understand how everything reached this conclusion, we must go back. Long before the speeches, before the war, before the furor. We must return to the beginning, when everything was still just resentment contained inside the heart of a young man who had failed. Because before the Holocaust, there was a shattered dream, a city saturated with prejudice, a lost war, and an entire people who would pay the price for it all. Before the hatred, there was a dream, and it was a surprisingly harmless one. To paint, to create, to become an artist. In his youth, Adolf Hitler was not thinking about concentration camps or world domination. He was thinking about canvases, brushes, and galleries. His greatest ambition was to gain entry to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. But Vienna had other intentions.
At the age of 18,
Hitler left his small Austrian hometown and arrived in the imperial capital carrying a bag full of drawings and expectations. The Academy did not see in him what he saw in himself. He was rejected once, then rejected again. He was told his paintings lacked the talent required for serious academic study. And with that judgment, without anyone realizing it, the first spark of genuine resentment was thrown into the world. Humiliated and without direction, Hitler began to drift through Vienna, lived in homeless shelters, sold hand-painted postcards. To survive, slept on park benches and in reading rooms. It was a dark, solitary, and silent period of his life. But he was not truly alone. Ideas began to keep him company. Dangerous ones. He found them in newspapers, pamphlets, and conversations in cafes. Nationalism, racism, conspiracy theories, all of it was circulating freely through the air of an imperial city straining under the weight of its own diversity. Vienna at that time was a cultural crossroads. Jews, Slavs, Hungarians, Germans, Czechs all occupied the same space, alongside tensions, prejudices, and grievances accumulated across generations. The Jewish community in particular was numerous, visible and active, with significant presence in the arts, sciences, and commerce. For the most conservative and nationalist sectors of Viennese society, this visibility was met with suspicion, with mistrust, with open hostility, and there was Hitler absorbing all of it. It was not an immediate transformation, but slowly his personal frustration began searching for a target. Scapegoats with faces and names. Scapegoats who had nothing to do with his failure as an artist, but who conveniently became the explanation for everything that had gone wrong in his life, because blaming others was far easier than accepting that he had simply not been talented enough. One figure who left a deep mark on this period was Karl Lueger, the mayor of Vienna. He was charismatic, skilled, widely popular, and openly anti-Semitic. Lueger used hatred as an electoral weapon, and it was devastatingly effective. Hitler observed carefully. He understood that words could move masses, that masses could construct empires or demolish civilizations. Between failed drawings and hateful speeches absorbed in the streets of Vienna, the young dreamer began to disappear. In his place, something harder and darker was beginning to take form. Because when art dies in a man, fanaticism often fills the empty space it leaves behind. Early 20th century Vienna was no ordinary city. It was the throbbing heart of a collapsing empire and a boiling cauldron of ideological conflict. Nationalists, anti-Semites, socialists, liberals, conservatives, all shared the same streets but inhabited entirely different mental worlds. Among them, a young man without money, prestige, or prospects was beginning to listen with unusual intensity. Hitler spent his time in Vienna observing, reading, and constructing a new identity. Not that of an artist, but that of a man who had begun to see enemies everywhere he looked, in the cafes where literature and philosophy had once been debated. People were now discussing theories of racial superiority and global conspiracy. Local publishers distributed pamphlets accusing Jews of controlling banks, the press, and international commerce. Racist ideas were not merely tolerated, they were celebrated. Vienna was fertile ground for ideological poison, and Hitler absorbed it. With purpose, he encountered writers like Lanz von Liebenfels, who promoted racial purity as though it were scientific fact. Poorly understood Darwinism was mixed with esoteric and nationalist mythology. People spoke of an Aryan master race destined to govern the earth, and of inferior races that contaminated its purity. Within this mental framework, a worldview took shape. One in which Hitler began to imagine himself as the future redeemer of Germany, the man who would restore order and purify the nation. And within that vision, Jews occupied the position of the absolute enemy, not one among many. The primary. One. The eternal one. Vienna did not create a murderer, but it educated a demagogue. It gave language to his fury. It demonstrated to him that organized hatred could be a tool for mass mobilization, and that the most dangerous ideas are not born on battlefields, but in pamphlets, podiums, and conversations that no one dares to challenge publicly. On June 28, 1914, a single bullet fired in Sarajevo ignited the fuse that would set Europe ablaze. The First World War had begun, and a young Adolf Hitler, without money, without a career, without direction, saw in this catastrophe an opportunity. At last he could serve a cause larger than himself. At last he could belong. He enlisted as a volunteer in the German army, despite being born in Austria. His heart already beat for Germany. He was assigned as a messenger on the Western Front, an extraordinarily dangerous role. He carried out his duties with discipline, was wounded twice, and decorated for bravery. But it was not the gunpowder. That left the deepest mark on him. It was the ending. When Germany signed the armistice in November 1918, Hitler could not comprehend it. At the front, soldiers were still fighting. To him it did not feel like a military defeat. So it had to be something else. A betrayal from within. This was the birth of one of the most destructive myths of the 20th century, the stab in the back. A conspiracy theory claiming that Germany had not been defeated by its enemies on the battlefield, but by internal traitors. Jews and communists who had undermined the nation from within. There was no evidence to support this. But it resonated with devastating power in a humiliated and desperate country. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, poured fuel onto that wound. It imposed crushing reparations, stripped Germany of territory, shrank its military to a fraction of its former size, and subjected the entire nation to public humiliation. For Hitler, this was intolerable. The country he loved with an almost religious devotion was being treated as a pariah among nations, and so, as he had already learned in Vienna, he searched for scapegoats. He found them. Once again, Jews were declared responsible in his distorted narrative for Germany's moral decay, economic collapse, and national humiliation. It was a simple explanation. It's false, but brutally effective. The frustrated young man who had once wanted to paint landscapes now began painting enemies, but no longer on canvas. He painted them in the minds of an entire nation searching for someone. To blame Germany in the 1920s was a country in ruins. Inflation had rendered German currency nearly worthless. Families burned banknotes for warmth, lines stretched further than any horizon of hope. And into that,